And we're back with the next episode of Zeitgeist. I'm Rauf from Palindrome Communications, and I'm joined by my co-host Khalid from Palindrome as well. Khalid, how are you feeling today?
Good.
Okay, so we actually wrapped up the previous episode by going through a bunch of business terms that are very pertinent, I feel, to the world around us today. Actually, they're a little bit dated. We were talking about the 80s and the 90s and how there was this dystopian view of technology, this sort of technological era that was coming and stuff like that, right? The reality that played out was a little bit more interesting, in my opinion. The world that we live in today is a little bit more interesting, right? It's very technology driven, yes, but it's not like we don't have flying cars like flying around us and stuff like that, right? But what we have is this semi-insidious communication system, a global communication network that we are trying to make sense of, right? Communities are changing and societies are changing. The huge monumental shifts in the world are happening, right? Because of the sociological implications of these communication tools, right? The Arab Spring uprising, right? That was basically a Twitter revolution, right? What's happening in Gaza with all eyes on Rafah and these kinds of things, right? So how technology and algorithms and digital communication tools lead into the set of words, echo chamber, viral, disinformation, fake news, right? We talked about the echo chamber part earlier, right? And, from their algorithm-driven content that is served through recommendation engines, right? So it's basically like you're going deeper and deeper into your own head, right? On top of that, we have disinformation and fake news, right? And now with AI, it's even worse, right?
Yeah. But I mean, to step away, to give some kind of neutrality, step away from the doom and gloom for a little bit. There are those out there that have kind of the contrasting opinion. For example, Mark Andreessen, who's a great technologist, one of the great tech investors of our time. He's the one that wrote a great essay on how software is eating the world. 2011 essay that became quite popular and had a lot of great points. So he's not he doesn't shy away from throwing some criticism and some or showcasing some concerns about technology. But I mean, I really like what he said in one of the interviews that I was watching with him, where he said that basically when we look at industries like the technology industry, for example, technology as an industry as it stands today, we can see two sides of the coin. We can see not the pessimists, but the people who skeptics, the skeptics who come along and they find problems and they poke holes at whatever has been built. And they say this is not good and that is not good and all of these areas and aspects need to be improved. That's one side of the coin, right? And then immediately what happens is that attracts the brightest, smartest, and most risk-taking optimists and opportunists, because they realize that there's a name to be made in being able to solve these problems that have been pointed out, rightly so, by the skeptics. And this is a cycle that's used in various industries, not just the technology industry. We see it from a historical standpoint. This is how progress is made throughout civilization. So it can go. There's contribution to be shared hand in hand when we look at how some people are naturally skeptical. They say these things are not good, and then we got opportunists, optimists, people with usually capitalists, people with capital. They're the ones that make their money from the capital markets and the money markets, as Ray Dalio said. They're the owners of the means of production. I mean, we want to quote Karl Marx, and they're the ones that come along and they say, okay, this is something that's worth spending my money on. Let's take a risk and see if we can fix the problem that all of these skeptics are talking about. Sometimes it doesn't work, but when it works, that's a hole plugged into a sector and we can move on. And gradually what happens is multi-billion-dollar industries are built and so on and so forth. So aside from the doom and gloom, it's interesting and fascinating to talk about a lot of the negative sentiment, but on the theme of narratives on the theme of semantics, we should have some neutrality in what we think is positive and negative as well. So yeah.
Yeah, approaching it more as scientists and like you were talking about what like the scientification of everything and this data approach to everything. We are actually telling you that narrative is a data thing, right? That if there is anything that is a data thing, basically it's the concept of narratives, right? And this is particular. I think this can maybe particularly be seen in the how technology drives communication today, as I was mentioning about, with echo chambers, viral content, disinformation, fake news, and stuff like that. So disinformation and fake news together, right? As concepts, first of all, one, right? When you have, and I mentioned this before, remember, listeners, right, that if you're out there and you spot two new words or two words that actually weren't together, right? This is very likely designed by people like us, by people in public relations, by people in corporate communications, right? If you have, like I mentioned, blue ocean and stuff, if you have fake news, right? In essence, each one of these words, right, is very neutral. The word fake is neutral. The word news is neutral. When you put the word fake news together, right? First of all, it doesn't really mean anything, right? Who is to say this is fake and that is not fake, right? We're talking about the news. We're talking about news that is already built on hyped up sensationalism. We were talking about echo chambers and clickbaits. Clickbait comes into that as well, right? Trying to get you to click so that the algorithm, knows that you like this and then serves you more of that kind of content and then tries to sell you stuff related to that, right?
Yeah. And on the note of combined words, I think again to set the neutrality to the entire idea of combining words in order to essentially empower or weaponize terms so that we can build movements against. This is the process of narrative building. People like us, as Rauf mentions, people like us, we do such things, and it's not always for the wrong motives either. So, I mean, for example, I can give you an example off the top of my head. Again, the great scholar and linguist Noam Chomsky came up with the term manufactured consent.
Manufacturing consent,
right?
Yeah.
Manufacturing is one word, and it's an indifferent word, and consent is another word. You put it together, and you have this very powerful term that describes, and it's an entire book that he wrote. It's a book that describes kind of the intricacies of the media machines and how that set out to control a lot of the narratives. Again, manufactured consent is an entire book that's based on this idea of narrative building as well. And of course, Noam Chomsky is very much against media and such things, or at least he's against the control, corporatized control of media machines, as he puts it. But that's beside the point, right? I think it's important for people in public relations, people like us in communications roles, to be able to identify terms and words that may make sense when put together, and then empower movements or empower change or empower decisions from stakeholders and so on and so forth, based on these words.
Yeah, and by informing the public about this, not being a whistleblower or a doomsday sayer, as you're mentioning about the doom and gloom, it's not about doom and gloom, right? It is about being participatory, right? I want to see a public or a readership, right, that is actually more informed and not sort of having knee-jerk reactions based on echo chamber, polarization and stuff like that. If we see a lot of, first of all, like we started off talking about narratives, right? You fit your understanding of things that happen around you, which basically you can say are neutral. If you see a person wearing black, if you see a black cat, if you see a ladder, right, walking under the ladder and stuff like that, right? These are all neutral things, right? But the human being puts their perception, right, based on their narrative, based on their understanding of the world, right, which is a narrative, onto the world around them, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, going back to that idea of how everything is basically well, not everything is subjective. Again, this is a very deep and a long-standing philosophical debate between subjective truth and objective truth. But there are many things that are subjective, if I may say. So George Soros, going back to George Soros, right, the man that everyone hates. His basic philosophy is based around the theory of relativation, if I'm not mistaken. The word is, if I'm not mistaken, theory of relativation, which is simply this idea that the markets are controlled by a collective of individuals who have extremely irrational impulses. And we cannot dispute the fact that a lot of the decisions made in markets, financial markets, money markets, even capital markets to some extent, are made by collectives of individuals with extremely irrational behaviors. I mean, Rory Sutherland, the
Behavioral psychologist.
behavioral psychologist and the owner of Burnett. I mean, one of the
I think he's like the global director of Saatchi, I think.
Saatchi?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the one that said very nicely. He said we're post-rationale creatures. We do first, and after that we try to rationalize our behaviors after the fact. And so that's something to consider as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning, right, sort of sleepwalking unconsciously through what's happening around you when there are so many big shifts happening around you, right? I think if people sort of wake up, right, and begin to be able to understand what's like these words in the media, right, and how these words are used, and the agendas behind them, and the money behind them, and the meaning that is poured into them, right? If they're able to take this participatory approach, I feel that this is kind of like the missing key, right, to building to actually moving our world into a new direction, because the polarization and the algorithms polarizing you and stuff like that can only basically happen if you are sleepwalking and unconscious through the whole process, right? If you are aware and awake, it can't happen to you, right?
Yeah. So it's about that awareness. But there's this very interesting notion that you can only ever empower the individual and manipulate the mass. The great father of public relations, Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, this kind of line of thought, this school of thought about a kind of almost nihilistic school of thought about how human beings will always be, to an extent, when they form collectives, they will always be.
They have to be led and controlled and moved into a specific direction, right?
Well, that's what they believe, Sigmund Freud and his nephew. But what we can say for a fact is that they will always be prone to extremely irrational behavior. Charles Mackay, the author of Madness of Crowds, and Patrick Boyle, the hedge fund manager, Patrick Boyle, talks about this in his YouTube channel. Very insightful content that Patrick Boyle. In his book, Charles Mackay, he talks about the madness of crowds and how a lot of these financial crises that took place were based on irrationality, so on and so forth. He talks about the tulip mania crisis that happened with the Dutch, if I'm not mistaken. But what's interesting is that while Charles Mackay wrote about the tulip mania crisis that happened a couple of 100 years ago, where he was standing at that point in time, he was standing during the times of the railway, if I'm not mistaken, 1700s, 1800s. He failed to see that he was in a bubble as well. So he was writing about and studying the tulip mania crisis bubble, at the same time sitting in a bubble. And the interesting and funny thing about Charles Mackay is that he was fanatically obsessed. He was an advocate of the railway, which in and of itself, according to Patrick Boyle, was an even bigger financial bubble than,
I think I've heard that.
than the tulip mania crisis. And so that's kind of interesting, right? In fact, Charles Mackay was such a big advocate that he advocated for some of the most extreme kinds of concepts in the railway business. For example, the one-way route, where you spend a lot of money to build one route going into one area, and you have to turn around and come back out. The train can't make one round. It has to go in and come back out. It has to make a stop through. It's a dead end and come back out. This was a huge loss maker. in during the railway times. It was a huge loss maker, and so Charles Mackay was subject to his own book. He was subject to the madness of crowds, which is quite interesting. So yeah.
So, there are so many words on our list that I actually wanted to go through, but it seems like we're running out of time. Soft power, anyway, just really quickly, I think I really want to touch on this ESG phenomenon that's happening. You mentioned George Soros, right? And he has this. I think it's called the Open Society Foundation, which has a lot of money behind it. I think $30 billion behind it, right? And it's pushing this agenda, or like a sort of the main force basically behind this ESG movement, right? Which has, and I just want to touch on this briefly. Maybe we might not be able to cover it in this episode. Maybe we might leave it for the next episode. But it's very important, I think, to understand that there is something big happening in a lot of businesses and industries, and I think business people cannot afford to not know about these. ESG, environmental, sustainable, and what sustainability and governance, right? What our PMX calls tata kelola, governance, right? So I'm old enough actually to know that these words are basically new words: sustainability, diversity, inclusion, equity, right? And then we have normal words like justice, fairness, welfare and stuff like that. So yeah, I think this is something we're going to have to cover in the next episode because we're running out of time. But just to give a brief touch on it, and do tune in to the next episode of Zeitgeist. Thank you for listening.